I'd like to say a few quick thank yous, given that this is the last event. The first thank you is to the Faculty of Arts, Law and Social Sciences who support this lecture series and provide the kind of financial support to make it happen. The second person I'd like to thank is Helen Piper from Film and TV, who's played a huge role in organising the series in partnership with the Autumn Art Lectures this year. I'd also like to thank George Thomas, who provides our administrative support. He's not here this evening, but he might well hear this on the recording. And that reminds me to mention that we are recording this evening, and I want to thank the students from Film and TV who are doing the recording. They've recorded all 3 events this year and done a great job of it. And I think that's everything I need to say. I'm going to hand over to Teresa from Film and TV, who's going to introduce our speaker.
All right, thank you so much, Peter. Yeah, hi everyone. Welcome to the 3rd and last lecture in this year's Autumn Art Lecture series. It's so lovely to see so many of you here. My name is Dr. Teresa Trimmel. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Film and Television here at the University of Bristol. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Beth Johnson, who will be sharing her fascinating research here today with us. Professor Beth Johnson is a professor of television media studies at the University of Leeds, and her research explores television production and representation with a particular focus on intersectional inequalities across class, race, gender, and place. She currently leads the AHRC-funded project What's On? Rethinking Class in the Television Industry, in partnership with the BBC and Channel 4. And her most recent book, Sally Wainwright, which she co-authored with Christine Gorton, was published in September 2025 by the Manchester University Press. And Professor Johnson has published widely on television, cultural, politics, and media industries, and contributes extensively to EDI initiatives across higher education and the screen sector. And in tonight's lecture, she will examine how inequalities in the TV industry shape both production and representation on screen. And as she argues, television is often described as a public art, yet the industry continues to reflect deep inequalities of class, race, gender, and place, influencing who gains access to creative work and whose voices are heard. So today she will be drawing on findings from her research project What's On? Rethinking Class in the TV Industry, and she will be situating these issues within current debates about the future of public service broadcasting. And she will also be asking what it would take to reimagine television as a truly public and inclusive medium. So please join me in welcoming Professor Beth Johnson. Thank you so much, Beth, for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you to Helen, and thank you to Peter also. So good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being here this evening, and thank you to the University of Bristol's Faculty of Arts, Law and Social Sciences for inviting me to speak as part of this year's Autumn Art Lecture Series. So my name's Beth Johnson. I'm a Professor of Television and Media Studies at the University of Leeds. And I'd like to begin this evening with a claim that might sound strange in an age of streaming and scrolls. Television is Britain's most enduring public art. Not public in the bureaucratic sense, though the BBC's charter still says as much, but public in the deeper sense of the word. Made with others, about others, for the common imagination. Before television, radio had already taught the nation how to listen together, to gather around a sound that belonged to everyone. But television transformed that, and it transformed that collective listening into a collective seeing. It brought the public arts into the home, turning the living room into a theatre, a gallery, and a debating chamber all at once. It was our first domestic public art, one that made vision itself a shared civic act. For decades, it stitched the national story together through light, voice, repetition, and care. And that's what I mean by public art, a collective craft that depends very much on shared labour and shared attention, an art made among people, not above them. But the conditions that sustain that art are fraying. Over the past few years, I've been leading a research project called What's On? Rethinking Class in the Television Industry, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And that project has involved working with Channel 4 and the BBC, and we've interviewed television writers, runners, producers, editors, set designers, continuity personnel, you name it. We've spoken to those people, and it's been fantastic. But they are the people who make television possible. And again, they describe the same paradox. I love it, and I'm exhausted. And that exhaustion isn't private, it's structural. So the very system that once defined drama as a civic art, stable jobs, regional bases, time to experiment, now runs on insecurity, on overwork, and on exclusion. And when those pressures shape the lives of the makers, they also then shape the art itself, the rhythms of the edit, the texture of the story, the sense of who belongs on screen. And I think in lots of ways that's the thread that connects all of my research, from articles that are forthcoming on television labour, for example, and an article called In Whose Service, which thinks about public service broadcasting and UK TV drama, from work on Russell T Davies to the book on Sally Wainwright, which was co-authored with Kristen Gorton. So really, I study how class, gender, race, region and care are lived in the production of television, and how those lived qualities and inequalities become aesthetic ones. In other words, I study what happens when a public art is built on private exhaustion. And I think in lots of ways that question feels newly urgent. This week, as we have seen and read, the BBC's Director General, Tim Davie, and Head of News, Deborah Turnus, both resigned. Symbolic tremors in the long prelude to charter renewal. Their departures come amidst growing tension over independence, funding, and political hostility. And behind, at least initially, the polite language of transition sits a larger unease. What in 2025 does it mean for television to belong to the public at all? Because television is not just an institution or an industry, it's one of the few spaces where Britain still rehearses a sense of itself. And when that space narrows, the imagination narrows with it. So in lots of ways tonight, I'd like to ask how we might reclaim television as a public art, not through nostalgia, but through attention. Attention to the people who make it, to the publics who watch it and who sometimes feel excluded from it, and to the fragile ethics of care that keep it alive. As the scholar Des Friedman reminds us, public service broadcasting was never a moral absolute, but rather it was a field of struggle, shaped by compromises between state and market and citizen. And I think that insight matters now. It allows us to talk about the BBC and its peers, not as fallen angels, if you will, but as imperfect institutions through which the public imagination is constantly contested. So in that spirit, tonight's lecture won't offer nostalgia for a lost golden age of drama broadcasting. Instead, it'll ask what it might mean here in 2025 to reclaim television as a public art, one that carries within it traces of work, fatigue, joy, and hope, one that still aspires to make something shared out of all that we hold in common. Okay, Just for a moment, I'd like you to imagine the glow of a living room screen in 1962. The family gathered, the cat walking across the floor, the kettle still steaming. Television entered homes as an object, but also as a promise that culture could be domestic and that art could live with us. Now move to that scene in 2025. It might be that the glow is smaller. It might be that the sound's tinny from a phone speaker. The audience might be fragmented between tabs. And yet, the impulse is the same, to find in this flicker of light something of ourselves. That double scene, I think, captures the endurance of television as a public art. It's not about nostalgia for the past, but about continuity of feeling, the way that television carries forward the everyday textures of collective life. Unlike gallery art or theatre, television doesn't wait for us to seek it out. It arrives uninvited but familiar into the private sphere, reminding us that the private is never really just private. Television drama is the public art of the domestic. It takes the materials of ordinary life, so the argument, the joke, the pause before the news, and it turns them into shared meaning. Its artistry lies not only in the image, but in the act of making itself. Hundreds of people, each performing small, intricate labours of attention to make a scene feel effortless. And yet that collective ideal has always been fragile. Television is a classed art, one whose collaborative promise is undermined by deep inequalities in access, recognition and reward. In the UK television industry, and particularly my research is focusing on drama, class is not simply about an accent or a storyline. It is the precondition that determines who can afford to stay. Those inequalities shape who gets to make television, whose lives and voices appear on screen, and who feels seen when they watch. The contradiction at the heart of British television is this: it presents itself as a democratic medium while depending on increasingly undemocratic conditions of labour. The very people who sustain its public mission are often working under the strain of insecurity and exhaustion. And I think to understand what that means, we need to look closely at how British television drama is actually made today. So most people working in UK television drama are not permanent employees. The industry runs almost entirely on short-term project-based contracts. So when a show's commissioned, a team is hired for that specific production, works intensely for a few months, and then disperses. Now, evidence from Screen Skills, BEC2, which is essentially the UK trade union representing people who work in the creative industries across TV, film, theatre, live events, digital media, etc. And the British Screen Forum suggests that between half and 3/4 of the television production workforce are freelance or on non-permanent contracts. On top of that, work's often found informally, so through contacts primarily, also through Facebook groups or WhatsApp groups, rather than through open advertisement. People talk about living by the call sheet, knowing that a single missed message can mean weeks without income. Since the pandemic, this instability has deepened. BEC2's 2024 report found that around 2/3 of freelancers had been without work for long periods in that year, and many were considering leaving the industry altogether. And in our interviews, workers described the toll of that uncertainty. They said, you never stop looking for the next job. If you say no once, you might never get asked again. You're expected to love it enough not to rest. And in lots of ways, that's what I mean by a culture of overwork and insecurity. This is not a side issue. It's how the system sustains itself, running on passion and flexibility and personal sacrifice, which are all qualities that in lots of ways look admirable from the outside, but wear people down over time. And these conditions don't just affect those behind the scenes, they also shape what reaches our screen. So the same speed and pressure and volatility that define the working lives of crews also increasingly define the aesthetic rhythms of television drama itself. The rush to deliver, the lack of rest, all of that seeps into the programmes that we watch. So the exhaustion of production becomes the energy of the image. The long days, the compressed deadlines, the constant churn can translate into a kind of stylistic intensity, rapid pacing, emotional overload, the feeling that everything happens in the moment. In that sense, the pressures of the industry become television's creative engine, the force that drives drama's style, even as it wears down its makers. As our research team have sort of noted in a forthcoming article on television drama labour, television's culture of overwork and precarity is not an aberration but an aesthetic engine. The intensity of production translates into an intensity of form. And I suppose that sentence, that line, if you will, came from long conversations with editors and runners and camera operators, people who described both the absolute exhilaration of creation and also the quiet exhaustion behind it. But in lots of ways, television is made in those moments. Television is made in cramped rooms via quick decisions often, the choreography of the shout and the sigh. And it's maybe what Raymond Williams once called a flow, but it's a flow powered by bodies. And that's why I call television a public art, because its very form depends on shared labour, on human endurance, on the possibility of making meaning together. And that's the paradox that I explore in my work and research on TV writers like Russell T Davies or Michaela Cole, Sally Wainwright, artists who keep television's civic promise alive through sheer imaginative stamina. So in It's a Sin, Russell T Davies turns the domestic television set into a witness to friendship, misinformation, and loss, transforming private grief into public remembrance. In I May Destroy You, Michaela Cole does something equally vital. She refuses the easy grammar of trauma and turns authorship itself into a public question. Who gets to tell the story and on whose terms? And in Happy Valley, Sally Wainwright treats care as a form of civic strength, endurance as an ethics. Together, they remind us that television's publicness doesn't depend on scale or spectacle always, but on empathy, on making the everyday luminous. And that brings me to my next question. If labour gives television its form, then what gives it its feeling? Well, if labour gives television its form, then I'd suggest that care gives it its feeling. And care, as so often, has been women's work, visible and invisible, celebrated and taken for granted. In the interviews we conducted for the What's On research project, women described the paradox of being both central and peripheral, indispensable to production, yet rarely recognised as its creative core. A production manager told us, almost laughing, "I make sure everyone else gets to be brilliant." And it was said lightly, but it captured something maybe quite profound, a form of coordination, diplomacy, and emotional endurance that sustains the whole ecology of television. Television depends on that kind of care. Essentially, the quiet, continuous work of holding things together. But because care's feminised, it's also naturalised. It's assumed rather than acknowledged. It's performed rather than rewarded. In Whose Service, I talk about public service quite a lot. And I talk about it as a structure of feeling that fuses duty, care, and exhaustion. Now that fusion cuts across gender, but it has historically been women who carry its heaviest load. For the most part, they occupy the mid-level and continuity roles that demand empathy and organisation as much as technical expertise. They keep productions stable. They ensure that the public in public service continues to function. Yet their labour often disappears from the creative narratives of innovation or authorship. And this is why it matters to talk about care not just as emotion, but as infrastructure. Television's capacity to connect, to make meaning public, depends on forms of attentiveness that are sustained, not only spectacular. And care is the connective tissue of collaboration. It's what allows an industry built on instability to continue producing something coherent enough to be called public. And you can see that ethic of care in the work of Sally Wainwright, for example. So in the book with Kristen Gorton, we explored, for example, how her dramas turn endurance and empathy into aesthetic principles. Her characters, often women, often working class, reveal that care is not weakness, but persistence, a civic strength that holds communities together when institutions falter. Catherine Kaywood, played amazingly by Sarah Lancashire in Happy Valley, embodies this. She is perpetually tired, endlessly competent, and profoundly decent. Her labour is ordinary, but her endurance is moral. And there's something quietly radical in that portrayal. It challenges the spectacle-driven logics of the screen, insisting that care itself, the act of noticing, the act of persisting, can be the ground of civic imagination. Through characters like hers, Sally Wainwright reminds us that attention to others, to detail, to place, is itself a public act. It's a form of citizenship. And when television captures that, it becomes something more than entertainment. It becomes a way of imagining how we live with one another, through difficulty, through exhaustion, through care. And that's why I think that if the moral of the BBC's Reithian triad was to inform, educate, and entertain, then the moral of the modern television drama worker might be to endure, attend, and connect. Those verbs define the ethics of attention that underpin television's claim to be a public art. Well, if care's the emotional infrastructure of television, then public service has been its moral one. But the word public is slippery. It sounds self-evident, even wholesome, and that's part of its power. In Britain, the idea of public service broadcasting has shaped not just institutions, but imaginations. The BBC's first charter described broadcasting as a trust for the common good. John Reith's famous Trinity, to inform, educate, entertain, cast broadcasting as a moral duty, not a market venture. But it also imposed a hierarchy. Culture flowed downward from essentially those who made programmes to those who received them. And that's the tension that has haunted television ever since. The idea of serving a public while deciding who counts as part of it. In our research project, we describe public service as both discourse and affect, an ideal of care that shapes how creative workers imagine their labour, even as that labour grows more precarious. For decades, the rhetoric of service sustained a sense of purpose, even pride. But it also disguised the inequalities on which that sense of mission was built, inequalities of class, region, gender, race, and disability that defined who got to make television and whose worlds were seen as worth showing. For much of the 20th century, that idea was upheld by structure. Long contracts, regional studios, in-house training, space for risk. A drama could fail in ratings and still be valued for its contribution to public knowledge. And that ecology created time, the one resource that today's industry has lost. Now we live arguably in what I might call the platform bargain. Television is no longer sent out to the nation in a very simplified way. It's released into the algorithmic storm. As one commissioner said to me, we used to send something out to the nation, now we just hope the algorithm lets it be seen. That shift changes everything. It redefines what counts as success and what we mean by public. The civic bargain, the idea that television drama could sustain a shared conversation, has been replaced by a logic of exposure. Reach becomes the measure of worth. In the article on intergenerational divides that we're currently working on as part of the project research, we suggest that abundance masks inequality. The proliferation of content coincides with the contraction of opportunity. So we're surrounded by more television than ever, yet fewer people are able to make it, and fewer still are recognised for doing so. For audiences too, abundance produces fatigue, the exhaustion of choice, the erosion of trust. The rhetoric of diversity and inclusion is welcome, but can sometimes conceal how deeply structural inequalities persist. Regional voices still struggle for airtime. Working class experiences are often reframed through a middle class gaze and middle class aesthetics. And while public service is still invoked, its economic foundations have been steadily dismantled. So this is not simply a story about decline or nostalgia. It's a story about what happens when the moral language of service outlives the material structures that once made it possible. When that happens, ideals turn brittle, or as one TV worker put it, we keep saying public service, but nobody can afford to live by it. So rebuilding that sense of public value then requires more than defending institutions. It means rethinking attention itself, what we give time to and what we allow to disappear. Publicness is not a property, it's a practice, and a practice of care. And it's made in the slow labour of listening and editing and noticing. And that's why I argue that care, not consensus, is the modern condition of public art. Public service broadcasting, at its best, does not offer harmony. That is not its job. What it offers is hospitality, It creates space for difference, for contradiction, for being seen without being simplified. When I talk about the civic bargain, I'm not speaking in the abstract. We are right now living through the moment when its renewal, literally and symbolically, is up for debate. The BBC Charter, which defines the corporation's purpose, funding and accountability, is due for renewal in 2027. That process has already begun. Okay. This week's resignations at the top of the BBC have thrown those issues into sharper relief. So the departures of Davey and Turnus are big events, but they're not isolated events. And I think that they signal a deeper uncertainty about what public service media can mean in an age of political hostility, market logic, and platform dominance. Behind the formal language of institutional change lies, I think, a larger anxiety. Who gets to decide what counts as value, cultural, civic, creative, in the 21st century? Charter renewal has always been both bureaucratic and also existential. It's where questions of governance turn into questions of imagination. Who is the public in public service broadcasting? Who gets to speak for it? And how far can institutions stretched between ministerial scrutiny, commercial competition, and algorithmic distribution still claim to serve the nation as a whole? These are absolutely not new questions, but they also feel newly urgent. Over the past 2 decades, the conditions that once sustained a plural public sphere have steadily eroded. Regional production bases have been centralised or closed. Drama budgets have been squeezed, training routes narrowed, arts coverage reduced. Meanwhile, the industry has become increasingly dependent on freelance labour and short-term commissions, the very structures that produce exhaustion, inequalities, and artistic fatigue. When you combine that fragility with algorithmic distribution and political interference, the ideal of the public becomes precarious. One TV worker put it pretty starkly: we're still making public service television, but increasingly in private. We're hustling, we're patching. That hustling culture doesn't just reflect the state of the industry, it shapes the art that we see on screen. Television has become a mirror for its own insecurities, always reinventing itself, always performing vitality, always anxious about its relevance. So the challenge for charter renewal is not only how to fund the BBC, but how to reimagine the very principles of public service for a world that no longer shares a single broadcast moment. Because the deeper question isn't perhaps institutional but philosophical. What does public value mean when publics themselves are fragmented, filtered, and fatigued? Now, I want to be really clear, this is absolutely not a call to abandon the BBC. Despite its flaws, and there are many, it remains one of the very few institutions still committed to representing the country to itself. But if we treat public service broadcasting as synonymous with the BBC, we also risk missing the wider ecology of civic creativity, independent producers, community media, regional initiatives, international co-productions that also sustain public art. But what I want to suggest this evening is that charter renewal should be understood not as a bureaucratic exercise, but as a cultural negotiation, a moment to ask how we value attention and care and time. So the task is not simply to defend existing institutions, but to extend their principles into new spaces and forms. We might think of this as a renewal of purpose. What would it mean to design media policy that values continuity of employment as a form of creativity in itself? What if public service were measured not by reach or clicks, but by the quality of relation, the ability of a programme to make us feel seen or to recognise one another? If we lose that sense of shared imagination, the risk is not just cultural, but civic. Television, and in particular television drama, remains one of the few spaces where collective meaning can be rehearsed, where difference can be negotiated without violence, and empathy can be tested in public. To defend public service media, then, is not to preserve an institution frozen in time. It's to protect the possibility of shared attention in an age designed to divide it. If the Charter sets out the ideals of public service, it's workers who live by its contradictions. Every ideal has a cost. Every ideal has a cost. And in British television, that cost is borne most by the people who make it. Across our research for What's On, we heard variations of the same sentence. I love it and I'm exhausted. And that refrain has become the emotional soundtrack, if you will, to the modern television drama industry. It expresses pride, but also quiet despair. Television, once imagined as a collective vocation, now feels more like a test of endurance. And this could be described as the sort of passion economy, the economy that functions through gratitude. Workers are told they're lucky to be there, lucky to do what they love, and gratitude over time becomes discipline. One of the workers that we interviewed said to me, "You can't complain, you will never work again, so you smile and you say you love it." The capacity to love your job becomes a condition for keeping it. Those without financial or social buffers, those who can't afford to work unpaid, to relocate, to risk burnout, are filtered out. Class here operates as the silent architect of opportunity. It dictates who can endure instability, who can say no, who can take a break and still be invited back. One colleague said to us, "Everyone tells you it's meritocratic, but it's really about who can survive long enough to be noticed." And here is the link that often goes unspoken. When survival becomes the hidden qualification for staying in the industry, survival also becomes the hidden logic shaping the work. The conditions that push people to the brink, speed, scarcity, hustling from job to job, become the conditions under which stories are made. Exhaustion doesn't stay behind the scenes, it becomes the production rhythm. What workers cannot afford, time, experimentation, rest, television cannot afford either. The pressures shaping workers' lives inevitably shape what appears on screen because exhaustion doesn't remain behind the camera. It becomes a production rhythm. A tired workforce cannot take risks or dwell in nuance. So the industry compensates with speed, compression, and familiarity. Time shrinks, and with it, aesthetic possibility. Compressed schedules produce sharper cuts, simplified stories, fewer experiments. Exclusion behind the camera becomes sameness on screen. And this sameness matters because it narrows our imaginative life. The shimmer of television drama, its polish, its emotional intensity, is often built on the blur of exhaustion beneath it. And that's the paradox at the heart of contemporary TV drama production. You can feel this compression across many recent UK dramas, especially in long-running PSB series, where production schedules have tightened year on year. But it's not only the speed of production that shapes the rhythm of the edit, of course. Increasingly, writers tell us that commissioners often ask/demand additional hooks, more twists, higher jeopardy, faster escalation, often layered on late in development to secure competitive visibility. Now, those demands intensify the compression. Emotional beats are shortened to make room for plot. Scenes rush toward cliffhangers to satisfy the algorithm more than the audience. Stories harden into momentum rather than depth. These aren't creative failings, they are structural fingerprints. When time's short and pressure is high, the aesthetics bend to the conditions. The rhythm of fatigue becomes the rhythm of the image. If fatigue shapes the image, then only time can reshape it. The future of public art depends on the public health of its makers. And this is where policy meets poetics. We can't talk about television drama as a public art without talking about the conditions that make public creativity possible. Secure work, time to think, the capacity to take aesthetic risks without personal ruin. Because the truth is simple, when workers can't rest, stories can't breathe. And if stories can't breathe, neither can publics. So if labour determines who gets to make television, aesthetics determine who gets to be seen within it and what gets to be seen within it. Every frame, as I've mentioned, carries the imprint of its conditions: class, time, exhaustion, aspiration. You can read inequality not only in budgets and contracts, which of course are rarely visible to members of the public, but in colour palettes, in camera angles, and in television kitchens, the room where we're most often invited to imagine ourselves living, at least in TV drama. And one of the things that we've seen throughout our research is a shift away from the kitchen sink to the kitchen island, and that sort of matters. So it isn't just a change in interior design, it's a shift in the cultural imagination of class. In a research article that we're working on at the moment, we trace how British television drama's domestic spaces tell the story of class change. An aesthetics of stability has replaced an aesthetics of survival. So kitchens now perform, on the whole, aspiration rather than endurance. The old kitchen sink, enamel, cramped, noisy, was a site of collective struggle and humour. It was the sort of texture, if you will, of post-war realism. Working class lives rendered with dignity and wit and frustration. The modern kitchen island, expensive, light, performs something else. It performs calm and control. It's not about surviving the day, it's about managing it. But this isn't a shift that's merely sort of stylistic. Potentially this is ideological. So where once the home was a site of social realism, it's now often a set of lifestyle aspiration. The domestic imaginary of British TV has been sort of rezoned, if you will, for the middle class. Working class lives haven't disappeared, but they have been reframed, aestheticised, made into spectacle or grit, seen from a distance rather than lived within. One designer we spoke to noted briefs will frequently centre around this phrase, aspirational but relatable. That single phrase, aspirational but relatable, could be the slogan of contemporary British television. It describes not just a look, but a narrowing of the imagination. It reflects production economies, London-centric crews, limited location budgets, the globalisation of taste. And I'd say it reflects fatigue. When time is short, shorthand becomes safety. When representation is tied to marketability, difference becomes decor. And that's the danger. Diversity becomes visual rather than structural, a matter of casting, not class. And when difference is used as decor, empathy becomes performance. So what would a renewed visual language look like? It would or could rediscover the texture of the ordinary, condensation on a window, the clutter of a shared table, the silence after an argument. It could revalue smallness, quietness, imperfection, the qualities that make television feel lived rather than staged. Because at its best, that is what television drama as a public art does. It makes the everyday luminous. It finds dignity in what the market overlooks, and it turns attention into care. If class shapes who enters television and aesthetics reveal who's seen and what's seen within it, then generation determines who remembers how it was all learned. Television is an apprenticeship culture, or at least it was. One of the findings from our research relates to intergenerational divides amongst television drama workers, and it looks at the ways in which those generational divides are classed. Generational difference functions as a mechanism of class sorting. Who learned television when determines who can afford to keep learning it now. More broadly, the broadcast era generation, while certainly that era was not perfect, is really full of people who learned television and entered television through relatively stable salaried work, in-house training, long contracts, and a sense of gradual progression, almost a promise of that. So they learned in community, shadowing, observing, absorbing the rhythm of the craft. The platform era generation enters through precarity, short-term contracts, freelance hustles, unpaid development work, and constant self-branding. They tend to learn alone, they tend to learn fast, and they tend to learn online. Stable progression ladders have vanished, and when ladders vanish, knowledge goes with them. The slow mentoring that once transmitted craft, how to light a room, how to hold a silence, how to let a moment breathe, are replaced by self-teaching in impossible time. Now, this isn't nostalgia for hierarchy, it's an argument for continuity. A culture that forgets how it made its art will eventually forget why it made it. And when that happens, television loses not only skill, but soul, the sense that making something for others is itself a civic act. In interviews, we also heard mid-career workers describe being too experienced for entry-level jobs and too precarious for senior ones. They're the squeeze generation, the people who hold institutional memory but have no institution to hold it in. They keep teaching, often informally, mentoring via WhatsApp groups, troubleshooting across time zones, unpaid, unacknowledged, yet absolutely essential. If the BBC and ITV and Channel 4 once trained the nation's storytellers, today that responsibility has been outsourced to Goodwill. Goodwill, however generous, is not a sustainable infrastructure. So rebuilding mentorship is not a HR exercise, it's an aesthetic necessity. Public art depends on public learning, on the slow collective transmission of skill and judgment and care. If we want television drama to remain a public art, we must treat education itself as a civic duty, not just in schools or universities, but in how industries pass on their knowledge. Because what's at stake here is not just who gets to work, but who gets to remember what the work was for. So what would renewal look like? Not as policy, but as practice. If the last section sort of traced what's been eroded, then this one asks, what might we rebuild and how? To serve the public, it is not to flatter them, but to imagine with them, to treat representation as a relation of care. And that's the principle at the heart of what I mean by television as a public art. This isn't a nostalgic return to a lost broadcasting ideal. It's a renewal of the ethical imagination that made public service meaningful in the first place, that belief that creativity can still be a civic act. Television remains our most collective medium, collaborative, affective, visible, but its publicness will only endure if it's rethought through the everyday realities of labour, inequality, and exhaustion that define it now. We can't separate questions of aesthetics from questions of care, or questions of audience from questions of work. So let me offer 4 suggestions, not as policy demands, but as sort of creative principles for reimagining what public art might mean in 2025 and beyond. 1, labour justice as public value. Secure contracts, fair pay, and time for craft are not indulgences. They are the scaffolding of artistry. Without them, there is no care, only churn. To make television truly public is to make its work sustainable. 2, institutional trust. Reinvest in regional and independent production. Diversity does not begin with representation. It begins with infrastructure, with where decisions are made and who gets to make them. When the ecology of production is plural, the stories that emerge are too. 3, aesthetic plurality. Got it on the second time. Commission work that values accent, silence, risk. Measure success not only by reach, but by resonance, by what lingers. Public art is not obliged to please everyone. Its duty is to hold the space where difference can be heard. And 4, audience recognition. Let's stop confusing engagement metrics with empathy. Ask not only who clicked play, but who felt seen. Television's power lies in recognition, that spark of belonging that turns viewing into participation. These are not, I certainly hope anyway, utopian ideals. They're practical ethics. They're the means by which we can make the collective conditions of creation visible again. Public art is not what is made for the people, but what is made among them, work that recognises the social relations of its own production. Television drama can still be that art, civic, generous, unpredictable, alive. It needs time and trust and the belief that the everyday still matters. And maybe that's the real task for this moment of upheaval, not to defend the old structures of public service broadcasting, but to imagine or reimagine the spirit of public making, to remember that the opposite of commercial isn't state-funded, but shared. So let me end where I began, with that glow of the screen. Television has always been a paradox, mass and intimate, industrial and emotional, ordinary and transcendent. It's where a country talks to itself, even when it disagrees about what it's saying. Over the past 3 years, in interviews for What's On, we've heard people across the industry describe the same fragile conviction. You stay because even when it's broken, it still matters. Now that to me is a labour of hope It's not optimism, it's endurance. It's the quiet, collective act of continuing to make something for others, despite exhaustion, despite uncertainty, despite the shrinking space for care. And hope in this sense, I don't think is not naive. It's a form of expertise, the skill of sustaining meaning in hostile conditions. Every act of editing, framing, lighting, and listening contains that labour, the insistence that what we make together can still belong to everyone. So the future of television will depend less on which platform wins and more on whether we can preserve that shared purpose, that sense that to make something is also to offer something, that creativity is not an escape from labour, but one of its most human expressions. If we can restore the conditions of care, if we can let workers rest, let its audiences be heard, and let its images diversify, then television will not only survive change, but it will lead it. Because the future of television as a public art is not about bigger screens, higher definitions, or smarter algorithms. It's about a bigger we, a public that is genuinely collective, visible, and cared for. Thank you.